Hi, welcome to In Search of Clarity. At Clarity College, we talk about 3 steps you need to take to achieve clarity. You have to crunch the problem, you have to clarify your thinking, and then finally you need to communicate with your audience. Today, we're going to focus on how you clarify your thinking. There are 3 essentials you need to know about clarifying your thinking. First, it makes sense. Second, it's all about the structure and logic of what you say. And third, you can start the process right now. Okay, let's have a look at why it makes sense. Let's look at what your audience doesn't want. Your audience doesn't want to be taken on a journey through the data where you zig and zag through the information and then sometimes or hopefully end up at a conclusion. Also, your audience doesn't want a stream of consciousness where you've got a series of unconnected dots that you're randomly working through as you work through the information. It drives your audience crazy. All too often, when you see this type of approach, you end up with an email like this. Let's have a look at an example. Email to Ross. Ross, 2 weeks ago, you asked me to do that multiple regression analysis. Then last week, you told me to drop that and do the customer interviews and write them up by Monday. I knew I'd planned to be away over the weekend on a trip with friends. Last night, you said you wanted the whole team to drop all they were doing and focus on getting the regression analysis bugs ironed out by close of business today. And then, when we turned up at the meeting at 6 p.m. to present what we'd done, your PA said you had another appointment and that the client presentation to be changed. Amy. Instead, we want it to be clear, like this. Ross, you were not there when we came to make our presentation tonight and let us down after we'd worked again hard to get the presentation ready. I've had enough. Here's why. 1, you keep moving the goalposts. 2, you make us work on holidays. And 3, you let us down. Now that's clear. So what's going on here structurally? If you look at it, we've provided just enough context so that Ross can make sense of the email. Second, we've actually made a clear statement of what the so what is of the email, that Amy's had enough. And finally, with 1, 2 and 3, we've got enough structure there so that Ross is really clear on why we've had enough. So that's why clarity makes sense. It makes sense for your audience. So you're really clear about what you want to say and they understand what you're saying. Now let's have a look at what underpins clarity. And we're going to talk about 2 things, about structure and logic. And you'll hear us reference this a lot in the modules that come after this one. First of all, clarity is about structure. So when we talk about the structure of a communication, we're talking about its shape. If you think of the shape that we're talking about in clarity, it's actually a triangle. Pointy at the top, flat at the bottom. Less information at the top, more information at the bottom. But that's just shape. It's also about the logic of the ideas that you present within that structure. And talking about a natural hierarchy from the most important at the top to the least important at the bottom, but also about the flow, 1, 2, 3. So that's what it's about. It's about structure and logic. When this actually works, you get a natural top-down flow, a question-answer flow, if you like, where you make a point, raises a question, and you answer it, and so on, all the way down. Clarifying your ideas is all about synthesis. What I mean by synthesis is taking ideas that belong together and stating what the synthesis of those ideas is. We'll talk a lot about this. So that when you take your data, how do you group them together? How do you state the synthesis of those groupings? So that when your audience is looking at it, they know what the meaning is of the data that's about to follow. This is a critical skill in clarifying your ideas. And also, it's all about logical flow. So that's not only hierarchy, but the sequence of ideas. In what order are you going to present your ideas? Chronologically, structurally, or perhaps in the order of a deductive argument. So how do you go about doing this? How do you actually build a storyline and clarify your thinking? We believe there are 5 steps. First, you need to understand what's required, what your goals are, what your audience wants and needs, and also what mode, scope and tone will work. Then you need to actually go about building your storyline. That is, building the introduction, articulating the answer, the overarching idea, and then building the supporting case. And then finally, you need to test the logic and test the story. If you work through those 5 steps, then you'll achieve some clarity in your thinking. Okay, let's look at some of the concepts that underpin that we'll go into much more detail on in further modules. One of the key concepts that underpins this whole idea and this whole process of clarifying your thinking are the rules that underpin storylining. If you summarise those rules, we believe there are 5. First, every storyline must have some sort of introduction, a context trigger question that sets up what's going to follow. Second, you need to state the so what of the storyline. That's the overarching idea. We call it the answer. Third, ideas need to be grouped logically together and also in a logical order. Fourth, you need to be synthesising ideas at each level. So you're stating the meaning of grouping of ideas as you go up. And fifth, of course, you want to strive for simplicity. A good storyline is one that's simple and easy to follow. Now let's have a little look at some of the concepts that we've talked about there. So you've heard me talk a lot about the need for logic. In clarifying your thinking, you need to be aware of what type of argument you're presenting to your audience. We'll talk about 2 types of argument. The first of these is a logical grouping, often referred to as inductive reasoning. That's where you have a set of ideas that belong together and you state the overarching idea above. Let's have a look at an example. This is a simple update. The overarching idea here is that we're on track. Why do we believe that? And then underneath we have a grouping of reasons that make that proposition true. The first reason is that we're hitting financial KPIs. The second reason is that we're meeting people KPIs. And the third reason is that we're meeting change KPIs. And then underneath, we make the case that substantiates each of those, showing examples of KPIs. So that is a classic update and an example of a logical grouping to support an overall proposition. The second way you can logically group your ideas is deductively. You may not realise it, but deductive reasoning and deductive arguments underpin much of what we do today. It's where you have a series of premises that lead, and this is important, inevitably to a conclusion. Let's have a look at an example. And the example I'm going to use is an audit storyline, because this is a pattern we see frequently in our work that's used after a team or an individual's done an audit. The overarching idea here is that BIGCO must address issues. The deductive reasoning that supports it is outlined below. The first premise, the major premise here, is that BIGCO is tracking well, and we take our audience through the evidence for that, the reasons why. The comment on that premise is that, however, there are issues that are emerging that must be addressed, and we have evidence for that. Issue 1, issue 2. Then, therefore, what follows is that BIGCO must address those issues as part of their go-forward plan. And then we talk about how they must address them. Action 1 and Action 2. So there you have an example of a deductive storyline. So far, we've talked about why it makes sense to clarify your thinking. We've talked about the idea that structure and logic underpins all that we do to clarify our thinking. And now what I want to talk about is how you can get started.